Shel C from PaperOcotilloStudio, and this is the sped up voiceover version of today's live stream show over on Art Joy of Sharing Livestream. What Peg and I did was do some jelly printing, and I was working with, I'm planning on making a book like this, which is all used up, but it with all the pages were jelly printed, and so I had an half 8 by 10 plate and a 6 by 6 plate to use to load up paint, and some smaller plates which I didn't end up using. And I had a 4-inch sprayer and a 2-inch sprayer, and that was all I needed for the process today. I decided to start out with some So Soft fabric paint from Decoart to see how that works on the plate. It worked great. It actually stays wet longer and doesn't dry up as fast as things normally do here in Arizona. So I was able to work on a process that I like to call crusty bits, which is basically just applying color in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways and building up the layers and layers and layers on the plate until everything's quite a bit of layers, and then putting a very thin coat of a solid color over the top like I'm doing right now and pulling all of that off. The only thing that you need to remember when you're doing that is that the thing that you put on first is going to be the thing that shows on the top. So you're kind of working in reverse, but by adding colors and removing colors using different tools and mark making things, and then adding more colors, you end up getting a very interesting layer of paint on there that gives you a pretty effect. I mostly used tools that aren't things that you buy. Like I was just showing that one that is made out of toilet paper tubes, and then that tool I was using right there was a palette, a plastic palette, and that rubbery one that makes stripes is from a travel cup, the outside of a travel coffee cup. So you certainly don't have to have expensive things to go with your printing. You just look for things that have interesting textures. So the paint that I was using with my So Soft paint from Decor was the DIY paint from Canvas Corp brands, Tattered Angels, and it is very, very matte. It's almost like a chalk paint, and so it comes out with a really nice matte effect. And I decided to try to use it with some colorburst powders. So I put a coat of the DIY paint down, this orangey color, and then I was sprinkling some colorburst pigment powders on there and then spraying it. And I think that this would work if I had time to mess with it. I think it would be really fun. But what I did was make a very, very wet plate. And so when I went to pull things off, it was just a big wet mess. So I decided to experiment with that at some other time when I could perfect what I was doing without making sloppy, sloppy pages that slide around on the plate. Um, but I did work with that last little bit of paint that was left on there after pulling 3 things. And I added some of that yellow and some of the green. And that was the pull that I came up with using just all the DIY paints. So it's very flat and kind of suede feeling. It's nice. And then I was pulling up a second one, but I decided to clean off my 6 by 6 while I was at it. And it had some really interesting colors and things, because of course all that paint's just been layering on there as I've been using that as a palette for my brayer to pick up color. There's just more and more color building on there. So I cleaned it off every once in a while by putting an extra layer on there and then pulling it up. And I'll use those in collage and things like that. I was using old deli papers that already had a bit of a mess on them, the ones that I use underneath my camera area all the time. I just save those and then I jelly print on them later. So now I decided to play with alcohol inks. And so what I did was to put a very thin layer of white acrylic paint on the plate first. And then I was dropping the colors on and then moving them around using the brayer in some cases. And then also I have 91% alcohol in a spray bottle, rubbing alcohol, mineral spirits it's called in Europe. And I was splattering that on and making interesting droplets and splatters with that. And then I took one print off of it to get rid of all the excess wetness, and then I let it dry a little bit, and then I put another coat of that paint over the top and pulled the whole plate clean. And I did this several times. This was really fun. I enjoyed. This is the first time I've ever put the alcohol inks onto the plate before. Um, just because, we have lots of different types of inks, but we were just playing around today with different things. Peg had some FW inks, acrylic inks that she was playing with, and different paints. So it was just kind of an experimentation day with what you could put on the plate and what kind of prints you could get from that. So there I was kind of smearing around the alcohol ink, and then I added some more rubbing alcohol to it to make those interesting bubble shapes. And I thought that was pretty cool. Pulled off some of it with a piece of paper, and then I'm letting it dry, and then I put another coat of white over the top, and here's the second pull, which is pulling off all that excess off the plate. So now the alcohol ink is sandwiched between two layers of paint, two very thin layers of paint. And that's what I got on the excess of the 6x6. And then I thought that the pattern of that left would be interesting when I cleaned it off again. So here's another one with different colors. This time I used PBO Dyna silver paint. So it's got a metallic sheen to it. And then I put a thin layer of that on there. And then some of my alcohol inks, some of my rubbing alcohol. Tried moving the inks around with a credit card. That didn't work as well. I liked the brayer effect better, but something different. Spraying with a little bit more alcohol, and then I'm pulling the wet stuff off on my first one. And it does give me kind of almost some geometric shapes, which is interesting. Then I decided to fill in some of those holes with a little bit more ink and use my brayer this time to kind of move it around, take off the excess, and then add the white bubble or the clear bubbles again by adding the alcohol ink back on. So that one turned out really well. Put another layer of the very thin layer of the silver paint, and so now it's really shimmery and shiny. So I tried doing that. There's another cleanup off my 6x6. I tried doing the same thing with gold paint. This is PBO Dyna Iridescent Rich Gold paint, and adding some alcohol inks to that. This time blues and greens, and a little bit of orange. I think I end up adding in there, or gold, or a gold maybe, and the 91% alcohol. Sometimes I spray it, sometimes I splatter it on there with the little plastic siphon thing on the inside. It makes a different effect depending on how you do it. Pulling the wets off first, then letting it dry a little bit, and then I'm going to put another layer of that PBO gold paint over the top again, a thin layer. And all this, layers and layers and layers on the plate is something that you just kind of get a hand for eventually. You've got to maintain a thin layer of paint. You can't blob a bunch of paint on there because it doesn't work. It gets too wet, and then it won't pull up the old paint off the plate, which is what you're trying to do, is pull all the crusty bits off. So this was a pretty fun play day. If you'd like to watch the full recording of the live stream with all the talking on that, I will put a link in the iCard above so that you can go watch that one, and you'll see what Peg was doing too. She had some different things to do, but this is pretty much the end. I was showing, that's the silver and alcohol ink, the gold and alcohol ink, and I was showing the pairings of the papers. I can use those coordinating papers together. That one is white acrylic paint and alcohol ink. That one had a lot of alcohol. And then that one was also white acrylic paint, and I ended up getting 3 prints off of that one. Then these are the ones where I used, on those, that's a DIY paint, DIY and decor paint. Then these have a combination of the decor DIY decor paint and the So Soft fabric paint from Decoart, which is a nice paint for fabric and also works on your plate and on paper. And then those were the ones I did with the sprinkles. So, the colorburst sprinkled pigment. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.